Zane?
Yeah, now it's right. You never tell.
Last week they missed.
7-7 for you. Those who are in Israel, you'll have to.
We had to hear not so longest Parsha.
That's committed. Now, Parshas Behaaloscha, there are
51 years.
774. You have it, 774?
It's your anniversary.
Sure. Maybe if you could add some.
Thank you.
The first paragraph, the first section talks about the menorah itself, which is out of place. What does the menorah have to do with anything? So there's a rabbinic tradition that shares with us the following. We're just going to run through it until we get to the main point. There's a rabbinic tradition that tells us that if you tuned into the last half of last week's Parsha, you had the gifts of the leaders of the tribes, the Nesim. And the Midrash tells us that Aharon HaKohen felt bad that he was not a participant, and the Almighty tells him, listen, you're doing something that's far greater, the lighting of the menorah. Commentators note, beautiful Midrash, lighting the menorah is indeed very special, but there are other good things that Kohen Gadol does, right? There's the burning of the incense, there's all kind of offerings that are done. Why specifically do we focus on the lighting of the menorah? So Nachmanides tells us that perhaps this Midrash is referring to the idea that the temple brought us together as a nation, right? Something, people go, you participate, you feel one. Right, the Lahavdil, when there's a big parade in town, and the nation comes together. And again, not to minimize for those who need it, but at the same time, for those who think, should realize that there must be more in existence than life must be more. And we Jews are always about more, and we are about coming together, right? And we are about celebrating. But we want a little bit more than that. We want something a little bit more meaningful. Not to take away. It's nice. The country comes together. We're a big city now. We have big parades. We also have shootings at parades. So we're really up there, Baruch Hashem, like New York and Chicago. So we can feel good. But at the same time, what brings us together is impact on the world, chesed, right? Make this world a better place. That's what we are about. We have expectations. So the temple did that. You could imagine if you saw any images or if you experienced the parade of hundreds of thousands of people coming together, perhaps you could, in millions coming together. So perhaps you could close your eyes and think of one day the Beis Hamikdash, or people coming and bringing us together as a nation. Perhaps you can transfer that image into something that is more significant. When we lost it, what keeps us together are the mitzvot. And one of the few mitzvot that the Kohanim performed, and it still remained, there's still something tangible to that mitzvah, is the menorah, because we have the Hanukkah menorah. So therefore, the fact that this menorah is mentioned here after Aaron HaKohen feeling left out, that he was not a participant in the tabernacle inauguration, the Almighty says to me, you know what? You have something that will survive tabernacle/temple. You have the Hanukkah menorah, which tells us again the significance of that holiday. We actually read this on the peak, right, of Hanukkah. On day 8, we read this section to tell us that we have those mitzvahs that bring us together as a nation. You feel we come together, the idea of a Hanukkah party, we come together. So that's what we discuss in the first section of this parsha. Section number 2 talks about the Levites. The Levites are underrated. They were significant in the days of the temple. There was an expectation that the Levi, is involved with precision, meaning as an educator, as a teacher, there has to be precision in halachic matters. Halacha always talks about precision. But even when it relates to the emotional part of their role, which is bringing about the music, and this is something that the Levites here could tell us as well, that for music you need precision as well, right? You can't play Baroque music if you don't have precision. And the Levites were indeed the ones that brought out the emotion through music, but at the same time there was tremendous precision. And when you merited to hear those with great talent in that field, you realize, right, that the caring of a tune, it's more than just a good ear, right? There's precision that's demanded. So that's really the Levite. And when I mention about precision, what's fascinating is while for the Kohen, the gifts that are given the Trumah are not supposed to be measured. You're supposed to give an about, right? When we're told, what percentage do you give the Kohen? So we're told, well, if you want, you can give 1 out of 50. If you want more, give him 1 out of 40. If you're really not interested in him, give him 1 out of 60. There's a lack of precision when it comes to the gift that you give to the Kohen, which symbolizes his identity. With the Levite, it says, no, you got to measure it. You got to be ma'aser me-eser. It has to be a tenth. Why precision? They symbolize precision with their nature and with the contribution that they make and with the gifts that we turn around and give them. Now, the Parsha has also the journey in the wilderness that is taking place, but I'm going to turn to 784, and here we go. This is the main part of what we're going to be focusing on here. Okay. Vayomer Moshe. So this is going to be on verse 29 on page 784, where Moshe turns to a person by the name of Chovav. Chovav, you see it? Page 784?
Kaftet.
Pasuk Chavtet. Moshe says to Chovav, Ben Reuel. You see, he says to him. And who was he? The Midiani. So up until that, we're not sure who he is, but then we are told that he was Choten Moshe, who was the father-in-law of Moshe. So wait a second. He says, oh, I remember him, but he was Yitro. So what happened to his Chovev? Why does he become a Chovev? So commentators point out that it is common that when a person converts to Judaism and they want to remind themselves of the fact that they really have a new identity, they come with a new name. So this was his new name, Chovav, right? And it's a nice name also because it relates to the word chiba, of love. And this is a person that his journey, the journey into Judaism, is a journey of love. It's a love that the individual has. Maybe, Alan, if you want to make another chair, and it's a journey of love that the person must feel towards the Almighty. It's a journey of love that the Almighty loves such a person that is willing to make such a commitment. There's chiba. In addition, we have this major moral obligation to be kind and welcoming to the foreigner. That's what we are about, right? And you know the well-known story when Maimonides had a student, Ovadia, who was a convert, and the convert shared his opinion on a specific matter, and the convert's teacher, not Maimonides, a different teacher, called him a fool. And when he wrote to Maimonides about it, he said, if there's anyone who's a fool, it's your teacher. For calling, does he not know that in 36 cases the Torah tells us that you have an obligation to treat the convert with love and sensitivity, and he's lacking it, so he should ask for forgiveness. So this idea of chiba is a beautiful name that relates to the journey of a person that walked in to Klal Yisrael. And Moshe says to him, Nosim anachnu el hamakom. You know what? We're on our way to the location. Asher amar Hashem oto eten lachem, the one that was promised to give to us. And then he says to him, Lecha itanu, come with us. Now remember that word itanu, like ta'olech iti, you're going with me, itanu. And he tells him, vehetavnu loch, and guess what? There'll be some tov given to you. Ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael, you know, God has spoken good, and you're going to be a part of this good. And Yitro responds in verse 30, Vayomer alav lo elech. Nope. Ki emel artzi vel moladeti elech. I'm going to go back to my land and to my people. And you say to yourself, well, wait a second. He just converted. You're finished. That already you had enough? Like what's the problem?
Before Pesach.
For Pesach, yeah. So, El Artzi vel Moladeti. So, if you hear those words and you think to yourself, hey, they ring a bell. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha. In other words, he's using these words to say, I'm still part of the journey of Abraham, but I want to have an impact in my place. And the rabbi said that he had a concern. He wanted to make a difference. He felt that here he was, a pagan priest, well respected. If he comes to the land of Israel and he is viewed as an outsider, not given a portion of land, in those days at least, it would be impossible for him to have the strength, to have the footing for the impact. So he felt, if I want to have an impact, I have to be a person, right, with land, with property, and I have it there. I can make a difference back in my old country. However, I will continue with that journey of Artzecha Moladetecha of Avraham Avinu. So in no way was he walking away from the faith, but rather he was saying, I need to have something, I need to have land. I have to have something to stand on to be able to have the impact. So Moshe starts negotiating. Vayomer el al na ta'azov otanu. No, please don't forsake us. Ki al ken yadata chanotenu b'midbar. Because, you know our encampment, you know the area, and you could have a very positive effect on us because vayita lanu le'enaim. You could be like eyes for us. Now, what exactly does it mean, like eyes? Well, what does it mean? Is he's going to guide the people of Israel in some area? Is there something, when you say you will serve as my eyes, you're saying there's something I cannot see, but you could perhaps see it. That's what it seems to be what Moshe is telling us, that Yitro could see something that Moshe doesn't. Okay? And then, in verse 32, he repeats his request, but he's going to make a small adjustment here. In verse 32, he says, Vehaya, so this is Moshe, still trying to convince the father-in-law, right? One of those few cases where you have someone begging the father-in-law to please come with him, right? Vehaya, ki telech imanu, and he says to him, you should know, when you come with us, Vehaya hatovahu, he mentions the tov, a lot of tov. Remember before he mentioned that God said tov, you'll be tov. So he says, Vaya tovahu asher itiv Hashem imanu, that you should know that the good which Hashem will benefit us, vehetavnu lach, we're going to do good to you. But here, when he says, Vehaya ki telech, while earlier he says, Lecha itanu, now he says, Ki telech imanu. Moshe is changing it for itanu and imanu. What's the adjustment about? So it appears that you have to remember that when I am going on a bus, right, and someone else happens to be with me, hu olech iti, is together with me. But just as the ain of brings people, means you're one identity, you're one, what is being stated here is that he says to Yitro, you know what? You're not just going to be with us, you're going to be part of us. He promised him land. He promised him land. And the rabbis share with us a tradition, and we have a record from it from Tanakh, that descendants of Yitro were given the region of Jericho, Yericho. It was not conquered by one tribe specifically, but rather as a nation we conquered the region. It was given to the descendants of Yitro. Imanu, you are 100% like our This is what he is told. Now, what's interesting is that the text itself doesn't spell out that Yitro went with us or not. You need the rabbinic tradition. Because right afterwards we are told, in verse 33, with no break in between, Vaisu mehar Hashem derech shloshet yamim. They begin their journey of a 3-day distance. And the Aron and the Holy Ark is going before them. And they are guided by the cloud. Everything seems fine. And then every single text has those 2 verses with the double nuns, which we discussed in the past, that this seems to be a very significant little paragraph because we make it part of our prayer. it is, in halachic literature, is considered very significant because the 85 letters became a guide regarding the sanctity of a scroll. We talked about the fact that if, let's say, God forbid, there's a fire and there's a scroll in the house, right? And we're talking about in a theoretical situation where the fire is only going to destroy that house and no other area. And your question is, can I take out the scroll from that house to protect it, even though it will be carrying in a semi-public domain, meaning the transferring would be prohibited, no eruv? Can I transfer the scroll out? So we are told in the Talmud that if the scroll is an old scroll that has no letters left, even though it had sanctity, let it be. But if it still retained 85 letters, the scroll, that indicates that it has sanctity. And the rabbis ask why and how did you get to the number 85? So they say that these two verses have the significance of a sefer, one of the Chumashim, and there are 85 letters in the two verses from Vayi ben Saron, Vayomer Moshe, until Uvenuchamar Shuv Hashem Riva Vos Alfei Yisrael. If you're interested, you could count them. So therefore, we have the 85 letters. So this seems to indicate that there's some great significance with these two verses, for whatever reason. But right afterwards starts the complaining and the downfall. In other words, we've reached our peak at this point. This was our peak as a nation. We were at Sinai. Yes, we made a mistake with the golden calf, but there was forgiveness. We are on our way to the land of Israel. And now begins the downfall. And the downfall, Jewish downfall, begins with kvetching, it seems to be. Even though it's so much part of our masoros, of our tradition. But they begin off, they seek complaints. Right? This is the beginning of the downfall. And the story continues with verse 788, with them complaining about, what would Jews complain about? On page 788.
Rabbi Yitro didn't go with him, or he did?
According to rabbinic tradition, he did. The text itself leaves it out. And as we'll see soon, that perhaps it relates to what's happening afterwards. In other words, something happens now, and it has the Yisro effect. We'll see soon the Yisro effect on it, and therefore the text doesn't spell it out. So that's what we're going to see as we read this next section. So obviously they complain about food, right? We need, what do they want? Fleischicks, right? They couldn't think beyond. They couldn't think beyond meat, right? They couldn't. It was all about the fleischicks. So turn to page 790. And they're complaining about the manna. The manna, it's a spiritual food. It's hard to describe. When the Torah describes the manna, it has to give a comparison, what it is like, not what it is. And therefore they want basar. Moshe Rabbeinu says, this is, how am I supposed to deal with this? So verse 16 and 17 on page 790 is the answer. So how do you give the nation meat? So you would think that, that the Almighty should tell them to go online and make a big order or something, call a supplier. Nope. What do you need for this, for meat? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe esfali shivim ish. Go get 70 elders, not 70 butchers, 70 elders. And they shall be, now what are you going to do? In verse 17, I'm going to go ahead and communicate with you, and at that time I'm going to increase the spirit upon them. So, it on the surface has nothing to do with the meat supply. And then, in verse 18, he goes back and he says, you know what? And then they'll get their fleishiks. So there's this strong connection between the elders and this prophecy that they're going to have and the meat. And you ask yourself, what on earth are the elders? In what way are they assisting us with the meat? Page 792. In verse 24, Moshe gathers the 70 elders. The cloud descends. And then afterwards, the meat comes. What kind of meat did they get? They actually got quail, of all things. Of all things, they got quail. Well, it's the wilderness. You're not going to suddenly get a bunch of buffalo roaming. It's not Kansas. So they got their quail. And of course, they were punished for their attitude. So this is a portion that obviously needs clarification. elders, meat, what was wrong with the manna exactly. So this is something that is dealt with. So what we're going to have to keep in mind and put together is, number one, why Yitro is the one that introduces this section, right? What does he have to do with it? And clearly there is a connection. And obviously we're going to have to work on the idea of the meat, the complaint of the meat and the problem with the manna. Okay, so number one, you know, if you come to shul on Shabbos and you come early enough to hear the Vahi bin Sa'aron, it should be a meaningful verse, right? And it is. We said here, right? Vahi bin Sa'aron. Well, you know, back to 786. Vahi bin Sa'aron. Moshe would say, as the ark would journey, Kuma Hashem. Kuma. What does it mean, lakum? To arise. Is God does he need to arise? Right? What does that refer to? Okay, so perhaps it's a metaphor to the idea of acting. It's time to act, God. Fine. But then Rashi decides to share with us the following midrash that you should know. That if you do have the opportunity to look at it, it's a powerful midrash. And if you have on the bottom of your chumash, you have the Rashi there on the column to the left, about 5-6 lines down. Rashi points out that the Aron was makdim lifnehem. The holy ark, which was guiding them, was going ahead of them. Mahalach shloshet yamim. It was leading, right? About a three-day journey. And Moshe had to go ahead and call out, and he said, Hamten lanu, wait, al titrachek yoter midai, don't go too far. Okay, so when you say kuma, what are you calling out? Every Shabbos, Vayi min Sa'aron vayomer Moshe, kuma, and you're supposed to think of that Rashi. Don't go too far. Don't go too far ahead. In what way does that relate to us today? And let's say you are a Torah educator and you want to be that educator that does a good job. There must be a message in Kuma. Don't go too far ahead. So commentators note the following. You know, a leader is a flawed leader if he cannot take charge. If all he does is assesses through polling what the people want and then decides his policy, that's not leadership, right? And if you have people in politics that you could trace significant differences over years, not because they studied in great depth the issue, but rather because they sense that the times are changing, so that is considered weak leadership, right? As in the United, south of the border, it's a very fascinating country how we have an election here in Canada in the fall, and they have their elections a year and something later, and there's much more focus in the U.S. over the election. That it's a nation that's all about campaigning already. It's like a 4-year process, it appears. So keep your eyes out for a fellow by the name of Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden. And Joe Biden, believe it or not, in the early 2001, when the fresh Bush administration said something about Israel that was a little touch harsh. So from the Senate, Joe Biden got up and he said, we don't criticize friends. So Joe Biden, right, he's a lover of Israel and perhaps he does have an appreciation for what we are about. I don't know if right now on the Democratic side, at least during the primaries, you're going to hear such statements. Why? Because the winds are blowing in a different direction and you have to be in tune and in touch with the winds. That is considered weak leadership. There is a statement, and we studied in Pirkei Avos the Shabbos, and where we are told in Tractate Sota that in the Messianic era, the leadership will be like a dog. Pnei Hador kepnei Kelev. This is a very old rabbinic statement. And Rabbi Yisrael Salant explained that if you ever watch a person walking their dog, on the surface it would appear that the dog is leading. Right? That's how it looks. The dog is leading. But Rabbi Yisrael says, how do you know who really makes the decisions? When you come to a corner and the dog turns around and sees where the owner wants to go, then you realize who's in charge. And he says that at a time when leadership is not fulfilling their responsibility, they're always like the dog turning back and trying to assess what direction do they want me to go. This is what he knows. So that's not leadership. But then there's another unhealthy leadership that relates specifically to Torah leadership. When the leader is not in tune with the generation. When you walk in with standards that are impossible to follow, impossible to relate to, right? When you have a situation of a head of the yeshiva, right, who expects every single student to sit and learn for 4 hours straight when it's not possible, and he creates an environment of disrespect for the student that doesn't do it, he is a failure. Because he practices on that level, but he is too far ahead. He is too far ahead. So I remember, I actually have a little booklet. It's called Binyan Olam. Binyan Olam, it's a little booklet that was popular in my days in yeshiva going back 30 years ago. And we had the mashgiach in the yeshiva at the time, Rabbi Milevsky, and he went through the booklet, and he said he wasn't so excited about it. And then he said, listen, if you decide to read it, fine, but for sure avoid chapter 13. Obviously everybody, now he meant, he was an honest person, so what's chapter 13? And the older I got, the more I realized that it was words of wisdom. Chapter 13 he felt is an awful chapter, because it's a very harsh chapter about how terrible Bitul Torah is. Meaning, the challenge of the yeshiva student is he's sitting there for 4 hours. Don't waste time, right? Don't enter into a conversation about the local sports team, focus on the text. A young man is going to be doing it at some point if he's able to control himself less, if not more. Chapter 13 is a very harsh chapter about Bitul Torah, about nullifying or not being committed fully to the study of Torah. This harsh chapter for this leader, in other words, for this Rabbi Milevsky, who was a worthy leader, he sensed you cannot bring in text that is too harsh for a young person. You have to be in tune, right? And this was a big problem when it comes to many American students that went to their Sunday school in the decades after the war, that quite often they would get these educators. You hear stories about it in Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, that they would get these educators that came from the old country and had zero understanding of how on earth can you be so involved in baseball? What's so great about baseball, right? Remember my mother sharing with me how it bothered her so much, right? That my mother told me that it bothered her mother, my bubby. So obviously my bubby grew up in a little village in Poland called Rutki in the Białystok region. And then she spent time in Lithuania, then in Shanghai, then in Cleveland. And then the youngest child was a boy. So the boy at age 9, 10 at night would listen to the Cleveland Browns on the radio. And for Bubby, this was unacceptable. Like, what on earth? Like, she couldn't relate to the idea that the young boy is interested in hearing the radio, wants to hear how his team is doing. She couldn't relate to the idea. When you're from a different time, you are too far away, and you're not going to guide anymore. If you are going to be demanding too much, if the distance is too great, sorry, you're not going to be the guide. So the distance has to be one that we consider acceptable, and this is the Kuma. Kuma Hashem. So what did the rabbis tell us? Don't go too far, meaning be knowledgeable, understand what the generation needs, and adjust your speed to what the nation needs. Okay, so that's the idea of the Kuma. And really, when Moshe Rabbeinu led the nation, he was not completely in tune with what that generation needed, it appears. It appears so. And these are words that you have to be careful, right? Now, Moshe, did he not know? So I quote here from Reb Tzadok Hakon of Lublin, and he writes the following, that, think about it, why is it that Jethro, Yitro, is the one that suggests rabbinic court back in Parshat Yitro? And here too, right as we introduce the portion that brings about these 70 elders that deals with the nation based on their need. Because obviously, if when they ask for meat, they are said, okay, here are your 70 elders. So you have to do the math and you realize that the 70 elders were there to work with them, to guide them. Okay, you need meat, right? You're human, right? You're physical. You need physical needs. Moshe Rabbeinu is a man. You know what a man means? He's supernatural. He spent time on the top of the mountain. He's detached. Now that the nation is on a lower level and there's this gap, and they want the meat, so they're not on the man level, so what do they need? Elders to relate to them. Elders to relate to them. You know, that it's interesting that when you visit yeshiva nowadays, a yeshiva high school in the United States, I like when I go back to Chicago, I try to go back every once in a while, and you walk into the Bet Midrash, a very inspiring place, especially if I spend time there. But I always enjoy walking in as a sociologist. In other words, what changed, right? Are there different texts that they turn to, right? What changed? So not a lot changes, right? Maybe the chairs were better, they have better chairs than they have. But overall, the philosophy is about the same. The type of things they're studying is about the same. But there was one significant difference I noticed is the types of educators they bring in for the high school. In other words, the high school teachers. While 30 years ago, it was someone that could give a good talk, right? Give a good share insight into the Rashi and the Tosfos. But when it comes to being that psychologist and like a father, older brother, and spending time with what the young man needs, it wasn't part of the picture at the time. While today there's an understanding, great understanding, that you have to go ahead and bring into the picture someone that really could relate to the young man, that really takes care and will work with him, right? And if you look at the crucial age, you know, when it comes to 9th and 10th grade, a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, when they're really trying to figure out who they are. So 30 years ago, they had a teacher, a good Rebbe, not really very much involved. Now, there was someone in my grade, in my class, who grew up in Milwaukee, a kid that came with a very weak background into the yeshiva, by the name of Mordechai Eisenbach, very, very weak. And I don't know about even his Hebrew skills in 9th grade, but he was a bright young man, worked very, very hard, and eventually became a Torah scholar. And he is there, not just the 9th grade teacher, but he's in charge of the high school of relating to the young students. Now the beauty is that when the Rebbe from 30 years ago, if the young boy would have interest in sports or some other real problematic issue, not something that just has to relate to waste of time, the Rebbe was not equipped because he didn't have interest like that when he was a teenager. He couldn't relate. But this Mordechai Eisenbach, boy, did he know his sports, right? And boy, did he have his girlfriends when he was probably a young man as well. So in other words, he knows very well what they're going through, and he, with love and commitment, and I saw him working, basically. You observe a guy that is running around working, and this doesn't end, right? This is not 9 to 5. He's there from 7:30 until 10 o'clock at night at times, right, doing his job. It's a generation that there's this incredible improvement because we sense you can't have the gap. There has to be a kuma. And sometimes you need someone from the outside to point out you need to make an adjustment. You need to change things here. Who made that adjustment? Who is the one that opened the eyes to Moshe Rabbeinu that, you know what, you got to change things. You are just too detached. Yitro. So therefore, before the Torah was given, Parashat Yitro, because it's Yitro, that something from the outside came and really guided the nation. And for this Parsha that talks about the fall, right? Yes, we're not on the highest level, okay? We're a nation that is beyond Sinai, but you need leadership that you could turn to them and say, Kuma. In other words, stop, don't go too far ahead, right? Maybe this should be also a verse that we sing before the rabbi's drasha, right? That it shouldn't be a drasha, the rabbi's talking about these incredible things and high level. No, Rabbi, kuma. In other words, be aware, yes. You are a guide, yes, and inspire us, yes. But don't start darshaning about standards that are way beyond us. Kuma, be aware of where the community is. This is a message number one that relates to this idea. Rav Kook always talks about the fact that when you put standards that are too high to the people, you are destroying everything. You have to be in tune. This is statement number one. There's something in the yeshiva called the chassan shmuz. Before the young man gets married, they give him some tips about, there was a great rabbi of Bnei Brak. His name was the Stipler Gaon, and he used to say that a young yeshiva student, the only thing he has to deal with as a yeshiva is the stender. Now he has to learn to deal with the person, right? So you have to give a chassan shmuz. So it has been upgraded, right? Using psychology. In other words, that there's an understanding that you cannot just walk in and say, well, you're such a smart young man, you can figure it out on your own. Times have indeed changed to the better. Now, so that's piece of information number one. Why is it that Yitro is the one that is really the opening statement for a chapter that relates to elders that are not Moshe? Because if the nation needs meat, they're not on the man level, they need people to work with them. Okay, that's piece of information number one. Now, if you talk about Jews and Gentiles, I would like you to think of the following question. As Jews, are we still part of the human race? Or perhaps, due to the fact that we experienced revelation and we have Torah, it places us in a different category. Now, before you even think of answering it, there are some communities that I would walk in and ask that question, and they would respond, without a doubt, of course we're different. Like, what do you mean? We got Torah, it makes us into different creatures. And then there are others I'm going to walk in, and they're going to say, what are you talking about? Of course we're humans. We happen to have these values, right? It would be very interesting to ask this question, how do we view it from, if we step back, right? Not so much the truth, but what are the different approaches? So in Hasidic communities, you hear that in Hasidic thought a lot, that due to the fact that we experience revelation, we are as if different entities. Fine. Now, others, from the more rational side of things, will tell you, of course, we're part of the human race. We actually have a responsibility towards them. We have a rabbinic statement, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. Everyone was created in the image of God. You're a member of humanity. So these are different schools, and there is going to be a practical difference between these schools, and that is, can I bring in ethical teachings that originate from non-Jewish sources? Can I bring in ethical teachings that relate to self-improvement, that relate to growth from a source that's not Jewish? So if I would walk into the more Hasidic approach, and nowadays, by the way, Hasidic is half the Lithuanian world, because there's been an impact that the traditional non-Hasidic world is losing the Hasidim won the game in almost, because everything is with Hasidic thought, without even them noticing it. So I would say that if you turn to 75% of the people that consider themselves observant, maybe even more, they would say, of course you can't bring in something from the outside. It's Goyish, right? How can there be self-improvement from Goy? Then you turn to the minority that perhaps is even afraid to share, and would tell you, perhaps it's acceptable. What's the problem? Now, to give you my personal attitude, I'm holding a book, a sefer called Cheshbon HaNefesh. Cheshbon HaNefesh. Cheshbon HaNefesh is a book written by a Rabbi Mendel Lapin, probably late, I think 1790. And it's about self-improvement. He has this magnificent system where he presented 13 attributes that a person should work on. And the system is that every week you work on one, And after a year, after 52 weeks, what do you have?
4 times.
You went through it 4 rounds. And it's a magnificent text because he talks about, number 1, Menuchat HaNefesh, calmness, Savlanut, Seder, order, humility, justice, attitude towards money, to do things with enthusiasm, silence, truth. Okay, and then at the end he has this bracket that you use. Now, this book would not be well known today, perhaps would have never been reprinted, if not for the fact that in 1844, a rabbi in Kovna by the name of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Lipkin Salant, who is known as the father of the Musar movement, who is really a luminary. If you talk about the yeshiva world today, you cannot have a conversation without knowing who Rabbi Yisrael Salant was. He encouraged the printing of this book. And therefore, what's fascinating is that when they reprint this in Yerushalayim, let's say in 1988, recently 30 years ago, so they write the author, Mendel from Lapin, and then they note that you should know that this was reprinted in 1844 or 45, al piatzat, based on the advice of Yisrael Salant. In other words, we're doing it because Yisrael Salanter. And this became one of those classic Musar books. Self-improvement. Fine. Now, the author himself, when he talks about the great challenge of making yourself a better person, he notes in his introduction that you should know, Lifnei Kama Shanim, a few years ago, Nitgale Lashon Gilui, something became revealed, a Tachbula Chadasha, new system. And he calls it something that's nifla, it's incredible. And he says that it is so great, it is as great as the printing press because it has to do with perfecting a person. And he shares with us this system, and he says that based on this system that I found from this new finding, I'm going to put together my book. In other words, he makes it quite clear that something new was discovered, a new system of self-improvement, keeping a record. And obviously there are more details. So you wonder who exactly gets the credit for this finding that impacted the Musar movement, right? If this becomes a go-to text, where on the Musar bookshelf you're going to find the Mesilat Yesharim of Rav Chaim Luzzatto, one of the greatest of thinkers and Kabbalists of the early 18th century, you're going to find this book next to it. So what's the source? So the source is going to be by a system that was created by a non-Jew, actually. In 1726, a person, a young man, developed a system. He only wrote about it in his autobiography decades later, where he presented 13 virtues. Okay, so this is from the English version: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, right? Sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, humility. Now, what's fascinating is that if you could walk into any school that is guided by Torah Masorah, which is a right-wing umbrella organization for schools, you will find plaques that have the 13 virtues of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. These 13 virtues are based on Cheshbon HaNefesh, which are based on a non-Jewish author. Okay? Fascinating. Is it so foreign? Not at all. Why? If a member of the human race figures out a way of self-improvement, and this person did work on it, nevertheless, why not? That's the Musar approach, because the goal is becoming a better person. And therefore, when it comes to turning to a Yitro, right, turning to someone from the outside, we could declare they could be our Einaim, they could be our eyes, right? And it's a fascinating tool. Now, by the way, I'll just mention the name of the author of 1726. You know what it is? It's Benjamin Franklin. In 1726, at the age of 20, Benjamin Franklin created a system to develop his character. In his autobiography, Franklin listed the 13 virtues. So the 13 virtues of Rabbi Yisrael Salant, and Benjamin Franklin, right? And in the merit of this, he got onto the $100 bill, it appears. Yeah. Anyway, so this is Parashat Behaaloscha and the Yitro contribution, and perhaps a few messages to understand what's really occurring in this very loaded parsha. I do thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.
Yeah.